Hello, this is Ralph K. Ginorio. Welcome to the 26th installment of my historical background to the 9/11 atrocities. The year is 1947. The United Nations, in a rare show of a Soviet-American agreement, has just approved the division of the British colony of Palestine into a Jewish homeland called Israel and an Arab homeland called Palestine. Now, Britain had also ruled Jordan, which is west of the Jordan River. It used to be called Transjordan. And back in the 1920s, that had been separated out as a Palestinian Arab homeland, but that didn't quite work out as a satisfactory outcome from an Arab point of view. So Israel is established in 1947. And Israel is this incredibly snake-like country that at its narrowest point is a handful of miles wide. Yes, I know. The border should actually be here, and the Gaza Strip should be here. I made a mistake, so Sinai is truncated, is a little bit impinged upon by territory that's not Israel, and I know that my proportions north and south are wrong. So sue me. I'm an amateur map maker. In any event, the Jewish homeland was actually smaller than this blue homeland that I make for Israel here. And what happened was, at the moment that the British leave, Israel is attacked from all directions by a handful of Arab armies. One of these armies is under a British general. And they have artillery and air power, and the Israeli have the weapons that were gathered by the terror organization Haganah and the even more intense terror organization known as Irgun. And they have settlements, and they have the memory of the final solution bright in their minds, and they fight. And for the next 2-3 years, the Arabs do all they can to, as King Husseini of Jordan says, actually I think he was Iraqi, to drive the Jews into the sea. They try again and again to drive the Jews into the sea. But in the end, the Israelis import artillery and air power to match and then overmatch the Arabs, and their irregular forces on the ground become the nucleus of the Israeli Defense Force, one of the most effective militaries on the planet, man for man, probably as good or better than any special force on Earth. So Israel holds out. 1947 is the year that the first of the modern Arab-Israeli wars are fought. And it's the first time of several that Israel spanks and humiliates the best that the Arabs can throw at them. So Israel earns its right to exist in blood by fighting. And by 1950-51, the fighting settles down. So the Middle East, for the moment, is at peace. And now we come to one of those great turning point moments that very few Americans at least know about, and that is the 1956 Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis is going to have implications planet-wide. The story is this. The British, after World War II, are exhausted. And in the last months of World War II in the Pacific, after the Germans surrender, the British elect Clement Attlee and his socialist government to replace Winston Churchill and his conservative government. And Attlee wants to fund New Jerusalem at home, including the national health care system, and the fact is, Britain at this point is utterly dependent upon American money, and in an act of absolute short-sightedness, the United States pulls the rug out from under the British economy suddenly and violently just after the war ends, demanding immediate repayment of loans and not continuing or extending any of the wartime aid. So the economy of the British, which actually suffered more from winning World War II than the Germans suffered from losing World War II, and that's saying something, considering that every German city was bombed back to the Stone Age, quite literally. the British economy was toast. In 1947, the same year that Israel is founded, the same year that the British leave Palestine and India and Pakistan, because they have no money, the British, who are rationing everything else as if it's still wartime, begin to ration bread. Now, they never had to ration bread in World War II, but under the socialists at the time of austerity after World War II, they have to ration bread. The British government tries to get its people to eat a South African fish called scoon, which the British cannot eat. They import emergency corn from the United States, which the British called maize, but they don't know how to make corn into usable food. It's a disaster. The British are impoverished, and it really isn't until the 1980s that the British economy even begins to recover from World War II in a significant fashion. The British can no longer afford their world empire, and this is exactly the result that many anti-British people in the United States government in the mid-1940s wanted. They didn't anticipate that without Britain as the world's policeman, that leaves us or the communist Russians. So, Britain pulls out of Greece, Truman makes his Truman Doctrine. Britain pulls out of Palestine, and the Arab-Israeli War begins. Britain pulls out of India, and it becomes India and Pakistan, and they immediately lose lots of people due to the struggles to get millions of people onto the correct side of the border. By the early and mid-1950s, the British economy is stabilizing and even in a recovery. But as part of their move to divest themselves of an empire they can no longer afford, they pull out of Egypt, leaving a royal government that's friendly to Britain in charge. That royal government is soon overthrown by a group of Egyptian army colonels led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser is the first Arab nationalist and Arab socialist Ba'athist to take power in the Middle East. And he becomes the poster boy for the virile third world man that's going to take the place of the decrepit, moribund European empires. Nasser wants a bunch of big projects, especially he wants the Aswan High Dam built to control the flooding of the Nile and provide hydroelectric power for Egypt. Again, in a short-sighted move, American engineers in the Eisenhower administration decide that they're going to play games, whereas the Russians give him an incredible deal. So Nasser goes with the Russians. Now, like any good Arab or Muslim of his time, Nasser wants Israel kaput, or at the very least he wants Israeli power broken, and he'd like to be seen as the man who did it. So he begins to use the Suez Canal as a bargaining chip. The Suez Canal had been built by the French, administered by the British for the last 100 years, and one of the terms of the Anglo-Egyptian treaty that brought the British out of Egypt was to leave the canal zone in British and French hands for basically in perpetuity. That the corporation that ran the canal would continue to run the canal, and that the British would see profits, but they would not exert direct control. In 1956, Nasser marches the Egyptian army in and takes the canal. This is an act that abrogates the treaty. The British and the French decide they're not going to let this stand. They collaborate with the Israeli government, and they launch a very effective counterattack that takes the Suez Canal zone back from the Egyptians. They have parachute drops simultaneously all along the line, and the Egyptian army is spanked and humiliated. Meanwhile, the Israeli tanks come across the Sinai Peninsula, securing the eastern flank of the canal zone. So now Nasser has been humiliated publicly. He had threatened to close the canal to anyone who allied with Israel, and now the canal is gone. Nasser bleats to the world about neocolonialism. The Russians, who are at the moment massacring the population of Budapest and Hungary in a repression against a pro-democracy movement there, they start complaining about European imperialism in the Third World, joining Nasser. This is expected. The Arab world rises up in chorus. How dare you, British and French, take this? What are you going to do about it, United States? All of this is expected. What's not expected is President Eisenhower's reaction. Eisenhower was not given a brief beforehand. Eisenhower was surprised. Eisenhower did not like to be surprised by the British. So what Eisenhower does, rather publicly, is he pulls the rug out from under the British, the French, and the Israelis, all of whom are dependent upon American financial aid, diplomatic aid, and military alliance. And he makes it clear, in no uncertain terms, that they will pull out of the canal post-haste, or American aid will stop. This is the power relationship at that time. The United States had the power to do that. But by doing it publicly, and by doing it angrily, he has revealed to everyone the essential impotence of Britain and France as independent players in the world, and their utter dependence upon American largesse. In other words, he spanked them in front of the whole neighborhood, showing them who's boss. They pull out, humiliated. Nasser takes the canal. Nasser claims all the credit. The new man of the Third World is rising up to take what the old men of Europe couldn't hold. The Russians claim victory. And Eisenhower's people wonder, did we just make a mistake? And later, Eisenhower admits it was one of his biggest. So the Suez Canal is back in Egyptian hands. But the lesson of Suez is not lost on the British establishment. The British establishment begins plans to rapidly divest themselves of their entire empire. If they're not going to be allowed to protect it, if they're not going to be allowed to defend it by Big Brother United Uncle Sam, then it's simply an exercise in masochism and humiliation. So the Gold Coast gets its independence as Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah in the late 1950s. And that is a test case for the orderly transfer of power. In 1960, British Prime Minister... I should mention, the government of Prime Minister Anthony Eden, which launched Suez, completely humiliated, left office, was kicked out of office, and was replaced by Macmillan, another conservative. Macmillan goes to South Africa in 1960 and makes his famous Winds of Change speech. And in that speech, he makes it clear that the winds of change are sweeping across Africa, and what he means by that is Britain is pulling up stakes and leaving African majority rule in its wake. So the British colonies begin to pop away. And within the next 10 years, except for southern Rhodesia, Britain divests itself utterly of its African colonies. Southern Rhodesia is not accepted into this because the Rhodesian people rise up and unilaterally declare their independence on 11th November 1965. And it's another 15 years before a series of events bring Rhodesia to African majority rule and the lovely genocidal government of Robert Mugabe that it's had since then. What 1956 does, what Suez does, is it makes it clear that the age of the European empires is done. Now, France continues to hold on to some of its empire and gives independence to others. But after 56, France goes through the hell of the Algerian War. A war that brings de Gaulle... That's really not his name. A war that brings General de Gaulle back from retirement and makes President de Gaulle ultimately decide to leave Algeria and divest itself of that part of the empire, opening himself up to a series of assassination plots. So France retracts, Britain almost completely eliminates its empire. And this leaves a world where the Soviets are expanding wherever they can, flooding the world with Kalashnikov assault rifles to overthrow colonial governments and those stable pro-Western governments that are being left behind after the colonials pull away. The British are not going to be competing with the Soviets. The French are not going to be competing with the Soviets. The Dutch are not going to be competing with the Soviets. Who will? The United States of America. And we have the beginning of the Cold War in earnest in the Third World, a period of time that gives us the Vietnam War, what the Soviets call wars of national liberation. And in the case of the Middle East, what that means is that the United States comes in as the protector of Israel and an arbiter in the region. This extends until 1967. In 1967, the Arabs are making it clear that they are going to launch a coordinated attack on Israel. They are going to attack from two places. They're going to attack from Egypt, and they're going to attack from Syria. Egypt and Syria. In fact, Egypt and Syria, under Nasser's direction, has become the United Arab Republic, the UAR. And so everyone knows it's just a matter of time before the Arabs put all their chessmen in place and attack. Israel decides waiting for their attack is stupid. So in 1967, the Israelis launch an attack on the Arabs as they're preparing to attack. In a few hours, the Israeli Air Force destroys the Syrian and Egyptian air forces on the ground, and the Jordanian as well. And the Israelis march in to the West Bank of Jordan, region occupied primarily by Palestinians, Arabs, into the Golan Heights, and into the Sinai. They march into Jerusalem quite seriously. Now, the initial goal of the Israelis was to break the back of the Arab militaries and make it impossible for them to threaten Israel for a while. And they do so within the first few days. But then the Israelis decide, wouldn't these borders be much more defensible than these borders? So the decision is made to take these territories and hold them. And at the end of the Six-Day War, the United Nations brokers a peace that keeps these borders. Once again, the third time, in the 1947 war, in the 1956 Suez Crisis, and in the 1967 Six-Day War, the Israelis spank the Arab armies. 1967 is the high point of Israeli power, and Israel, if you consider the considerable territory in the Sinai, doubles or triples in size, giving Israel some strategic depth from which to fight. And Israel assumes that for the next generation, which is about 20 years or so, it's going to be relatively safe because they have in fact broken the back of the Arab armies. We'll see how this assumption goes next time. Thank you.